Frank Delgado had spent the last 6 years waking up at 4:30 a.m. sharp, brewing a pot of strong, no-nonsense coffee, and heading out to drive the number 17 downtown route. Like clockwork, it was a simple life, predictable, quiet, just the way he liked it. His regulars were an interesting mix of the city's finest. Earl, the retired accountant who never stopped talking about the good old days, even though he had no idea what year it was. Simone, the overworked nurse who could fall asleep standing up, and Darnell, the high school kid who swore he was going to the NBA, even though he was built like a pretzel. Frank liked them. He never said much, but they were his people, and this was his boss. He was a man who had seen enough warzones for 2 lifetimes, and now he just wanted peace. But peace had a nasty habit of getting interrupted, and today was about to get a whole lot worse than Earl's never-ending conspiracy theories about the government putting mind-control chemicals in Arizona's drinking water. The bus was halfway through its route when it happened. 6 men, coordinated, armed, and about as subtle as a fireworks show in a library. They stormed the aisle, 2 at the front, 2 in the middle, 2 covering the back. One of them, the leader, tall, lean, and radiating a level of smugness that made Frank instantly dislike him, waved a pistol in the air like he was directing traffic. Nobody moves, nobody talks, and nobody does anything stupid, the man announced, his voice calm, controlled. Frank saw that look before, the kind that came from men who thought they were in control, but they weren't. Not here, not on Frank's bus. Earl let out a nervous chuckle. Bless his heart. What is this, some kind of prank? The man at the front didn't hesitate. He backhanded Earl so hard that the old man slumped against the seat, groaning. That was the moment Frank knew exactly how this day was going to end, with every single one of these guys regretting ever setting foot on his bus. But he didn't react. Not yet. He kept his hands on the wheel, kept his face passive, let them believe he was just some washed-up driver who wouldn't be a problem. It was always best when they underestimated him. The leader, Frank decided to call him Smugface, turned to him. "Keep driving," he ordered, shoving the barrel of his pistol against Frank's temple. Amateur move. A guy who actually knew what he was doing wouldn't have gotten that close. Frank turned his eyes to the mirror, sizing up the rest of them. The ones in the middle were antsy, shifting their weight too much. They weren't professionals. The 2 at the back, probably ex-military, the way they stood, the way their eyes scanned the exits. Smugface, some kind of mercenary with too much ego and not enough brains. And then there was the last guy, the one who hadn't said a word yet, the one who looked too calm. That one was the real threat. Frank licked his lips and nodded, like a good little bus driver. "Sure thing, boss." He eased the bus forward, rolling through downtown Phoenix like it was just another Tuesday. But inside his head, the war had already started. He wasn't a soldier anymore, hadn't been for years, but once you learned how to take apart a problem, you never forgot. And right now, this bus was a problem. They hadn't shot anyone yet. That meant they needed something. A hostage situation, ransom, or something worse. Frank wasn't sure yet, but he knew one thing. If they wanted to get to their destination, they were gonna have to go through him first. He took a slow breath, keeping his expression blank. He'd taken apart men like this before, back when he was patching up soldiers with one hand while firing a pistol with the other. He didn't have a weapon now, but he didn't need one, because a bus was full of weapons. The metal handrails, the fire extinguisher, the emergency brake. Hell, even a well-aimed punch with the right amount of force could turn one of these guys into a human paperweight. Now all he had to do was wait. Let them think they were in charge. Let them think he was just another passenger on his own bus. Because in exactly 10 minutes, this ride was gonna take a very unexpected detour. Frank kept his hands steady on the wheel, eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror, watching his uninvited passengers as they tried to assert control. Smugface, their fearless leader, stayed near the front, gun still pressed just close enough to be a threat, but not close enough to be a real problem. The 2 jittery ones in the middle were still shifting like they had somewhere better to be, which told Frank they weren't used to this level of intensity. Maybe small-time criminals, maybe just idiots roped into something way bigger than they could handle. The 2 at the back, yeah, those were the ones to worry about. They weren't scanning for cops or looking nervous like rookies. No, they were positioned strategically, watching for threats, anticipating movement. Frank had seen enough guys like them overseas to know they weren't here for the money. They were the cleanup crew, the ones making sure nothing went sideways. That left the last guy, the quiet one, the one who hadn't spoken or postured like the rest. He was the real leader. Smugface was just the distraction, the voice, the guy in front playing king, while the real threat observed, calculated, and prepared for anything that might go wrong. Frank exhaled slowly. Good, let them think they had this all planned out. Let them believe he was just another civilian, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He stayed relaxed, let his shoulders slump just enough to make it look like he was intimidated, kept his grip on the wheel firm but casual. It was an act he had perfected long before he ever set foot behind this bus, back in the field, when the bullets were flying and the air smelled like sweat, dirt, and blood. He had learned that the best way to survive was to make sure the enemy never saw the storm coming until it was too late. Right now, these guys thought they were in control. But Frank was already 5 steps ahead, building the battlefield in his mind, placing every piece exactly where it needed to be. Smugface tapped his gun against the side of Frank's head, bringing him back to the moment. "Pick up speed," he ordered, glancing toward the mirror, where flashing red and blue lights started to appear in the distance. So the cops had noticed something was wrong. That was good. It meant they weren't completely useless. But it also meant these guys were going to get twitchy fast, and twitchy men with guns were dangerous. Frank nodded, pretending to obey, pressing the gas just enough to keep them from panicking, but not enough to make the engine roar. "Where are we going?" he asked, letting his voice shake just slightly, playing the part of the frightened bus driver. Smugface grinned, looking back toward his crew like he was enjoying himself too much. "Doesn't matter. You drive. We tell you when to stop." Frank let his foot ease off the pedal, just enough to make the engine groan slightly. "If you're planning to outrun the cops in a city bus, you're gonna have a bad time," he muttered, keeping his voice just low enough to make it sound like a nervous complaint rather than a challenge. Smugface turned back to him, amusement flickering in his eyes, but the real leader, the quiet one, was watching him now, sharp and calculating. That was fine. Let him look. Let him try to figure out if Frank was something more than what he seemed. By the time he did, it wouldn't matter. The moment was coming. Frank could feel it, the shift in the air, the way the men inside the bus were settling into the false security of believing everything was going their way. The cops were trailing at a distance, not making a move yet, probably trying to assess the situation before going in. That meant Frank had the advantage of time, just a little, just enough to do what needed to be done. His eyes flipped toward the overhead mirror, scanning the passengers. Earl had recovered from his earlier hit, now watching the hijackers with a mix of terror and old man irritation. Simone, the exhausted nurse, was gripping the strap of her bag so tight her knuckles had gone white. And Darnell, the high school kid with NBA dreams, was hunched low in his seat, staring straight ahead like if he just didn't move, maybe this would all go away. They were scared, but they weren't broken. That was good. If he did this right, nobody here would have to die today. Frank shifted his grip on the wheel, adjusting the angle just slightly, just enough to start positioning the bus exactly where he needed it to be. Up ahead, an overpass was coming up fast, a stretch of road where traffic would funnel into a tighter space, where movement would become restricted. If he could just... The quiet leader suddenly leaned forward, speaking for the first time. His voice was soft, but it carried weight, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command attention. "You're planning something," Frank smiled. "Aren't we all?" And then he yanked the wheel, hard to the right. The bus lurched violently, sending every hijacker flying sideways. Smugface crashed against the dashboard, his gun clattering across the floor, while the 2 jittery ones in the middle slammed into the seats, their weapons momentarily forgotten as they scrambled for balance. The cleanup crew at the back held on better, but even they weren't expecting the sudden jolt. The only one who hadn't moved was the quiet leader. He had anticipated something, but not this. Frank didn't give them time to recover. He grabbed the metal bar beside the driver's seat, the one he'd always thought of as a handy blunt force trauma tool, and swung it backward in a single brutal arc. Smugface barely had time to lift his head before the metal connected with his skull, sending him collapsing into unconsciousness before he even realized what had happened. The two in the middle were trying to get up, but Frank was already on them. He drove an elbow into the first one's throat, cutting off his air before flipping the seat divider up and slamming it into his face. The second one had a gun, but he was too slow, too panicked. Frank grabbed his wrist, twisted hard, and felt the satisfying pop of ligaments tearing before wrenching the weapon from his grasp and shoving him headfirst into a window. The cleanup crew had recovered by now, and one of them raised his rifle, but Frank was already moving. He threw Smugface's unconscious body into him, forcing him backward, then vaulted over the divider and crashed into him with the full weight of someone who had tackled bigger men in worse conditions. They hit the floor hard, and Frank pinned the rifle with his knee, driving a fist into the man's ribs twice, 3 times before the body went limp. The last man standing was the quiet leader. He hadn't moved. He was just watching. Frank caught his breath, standing slowly. Around him, the bus had transformed into a war zone of groaning, unconscious bodies. The passengers were staring, eyes wide, caught between shock and awe. Earl let out a low whistle. "Son, you've been holding out on us." Frank ignored him, stepping forward. "You're the last one," he said, locking eyes with the quiet leader. The man smirked. For now, Frank saw the flick of his wrist, the movement too small for anyone else to catch, but Frank knew what it was. A trigger, a remote, a backup plan. The bomb was already set, and just like that, Frank knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Frank's mind processed the reality of the situation in an instant. The bomb was already set. That meant everything up until now had been a distraction. A show, a game to keep him busy while the real damage was already in motion. The quiet leader, who still hadn't broken a sweat, was standing there, watching him with the smug patience of a man who knew he had already won. Frank had seen that look before overseas in the faces of men who planted IEDs in markets and walked away like nothing had happened. It was the look of someone who had made their peace with destruction. That was the kind of enemy Frank hated the most, the kind that didn't care about the bodies left in their wake. He tightened his grip on the makeshift weapon in his hand, but the quiet leader just smiled, lifting the small detonator between 2 fingers like it was an afterthought. "You think you've won something here?" the man asked, his voice calm. "You think knocking out my men changed the outcome? You're still on my bus, and we're still on my route." Frank kept his breathing steady, forcing himself to slow down, to think. This wasn't just about brute force anymore. This was about time. A bomb meant a location, a detonation radius, a planned impact point. That meant the target wasn't random. If the device was on the bus, then this entire hijacking was designed to turn him and his passengers into shrapnel. But if the bomb was somewhere else, then they were just delivery. Either way, there was no universe in which Frank let this guy walk away alive. The cops were still trailing, keeping their distance, not yet realizing how much worse this situation had become. Frank didn't have time to signal them. His hands flexed on the wheel as he flicked his eyes toward the road, mapping out the final stretch of the route. A shopping district was coming up, a transit hub packed with people, morning commuters, families, kids. If the bus was rigged, they wouldn't have hijacked it to drive it in circles. They had a destination in mind. And now Frank did too. He exhaled slowly, letting his shoulders drop just a fraction. "All right," he said, voice even, controlled. "You win." He took his foot off the gas slightly, letting the bus ease down to a safer speed. The quiet leader smirked, taking a small step forward, lowering the detonator slightly. That was all Frank needed. In one fluid motion, he snapped his hand up and slammed the emergency brake. The force of it threw everyone forward, bodies crashing into seats and walls as the bus screeched against the pavement, tires smoking. The quiet leader, for all his composure, wasn't ready for the sheer violence of the stop. He stumbled, just enough. Just enough. Frank was on him in a second, grabbing his wrist and twisting hard, forcing the detonator free. The man reacted fast, too fast, countering with a sharp jab toward Frank's throat. But Frank had already read the move. He dodged, grabbing the man's arm and driving a knee into his ribs, knocking the air out of him. The detonator hit the floor, skittering under his seat. Frank shoved him backward, sending him crashing into the divider, knocking over Smugface's still unconscious body in the process. Breathless, the quiet leader coughed, his previous calm flickering for the first time. Frank didn't give him a chance to recover. He grabbed the man's shirt, slamming him against the wall of the bus. "Where is it?" he growled. "Where's the bomb?" The man actually had the nerve to laugh. "You're asking the wrong question." Frank felt a cold weight settle in his gut. Not where, when. He moved fast, scanning the bus, looking for anything out of place. A bag, a case, up there, a backpack, wedged between the seats, tucked just enough to look forgotten. But it wasn't forgotten, it was placed. And the timer, 47 seconds left. Frank let out a sharp breath. No time to evacuate. No time to wait for bomb squads. Just him, his hands, and a bomb about to turn him into dust. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. He lunged for the pack, yanking it free and flipping it over. Straps, reinforced casing, crude but effective wiring, not a simple pipe bomb. This was military grade. He knew what he was looking at. 4 probably linked to a pressure plate or a failsafe in case someone tried to tamper with it. His hands moved with muscle memory as he pulled the zipper back, revealing the trigger assembly. 32 seconds. He could hear the quiet leader laughing through gasps of pain behind him. "Tick-tock," the man rasped. Frank ignored him. There were only 3 ways to handle a bomb like this: disable the trigger, sever the connection, or move it far enough away that the blast wouldn't kill everyone on board. The first 2 were high risk, but the third was damn near impossible in 30 seconds. Unless Frank grabbed the pack, lunged for the rear exit, and threw himself out of the bus. The asphalt hit him like a hammer, knocking the air out of his lungs as he rolled. The bag was still clutched in his arms, the clock flashing 15 seconds. The cops were slamming their brakes now, doors opening, officers yelling, no time to warn them. Frank launched the bomb toward the nearest alleyway, flinging it with every ounce of strength he had left. It hit the ground, rolled, and a thunderous explosion ripped through the alley, sending a shock wave that rattled the windows, flames bursting outward, but contained enough to keep the street intact. The pressure in Frank's ears made the world ring for a moment, but he was alive. The bus was still intact. The passengers were safe. Slowly aching all over, he pushed himself up onto his elbows. The cops were on him now, guns raised, shouting orders he didn't care enough to process. He just waved toward the bus, where the quiet leader was still slumped, blinking through the haze. "Arrest that guy," Frank muttered, groaning as he pulled himself to his feet. One officer hesitated, then rushed past him, hauling the man onto the pavement. Frank took a slow, steadying breath. He looked at his bus, his route, his passengers, still stunned but alive. He exhaled. "Not a bad day's work." Earl leaned out the door, squinting at him. "Well, damn, son, you do this every Tuesday?" Frank wiped the soot off his arm, rolling his shoulders with a wince. "Nah," he muttered, shaking his head. "Usually Wednesdays." And just like that, he climbed back onto the bus, stretched his neck, and grabbed the wheel. Time to finish the route. The bus was quiet, the kind of quiet that only happens when a group of people just survived something they were never supposed to walk away from. The smell of burnt rubber and faint traces of smoke still lingered in the air, mixing with the sharp tang of adrenaline and sweat. Frank knew the passengers were still processing everything, their brains catching up to what had just happened. Earl was rubbing the red mark on his cheek from where Smugface had backhanded him earlier. Simone was staring at Frank like she was trying to figure out if he was a superhero or just a lunatic in a uniform, and Darnell had his arms folded tight across his chest, doing his best to pretend he hadn't been scared out of his mind. Frank checked the rearview mirror. The quiet leader was face down on the pavement, zip-tied, surrounded by cops who were barking questions at him that he clearly wasn't going to answer. The rest of the hijackers were being pulled out one by one, groggy, disoriented, and probably wondering what the hell just ran through them like a wrecking ball. They'd figure it out eventually. Frank Delgado wasn't just some city bus driver. He was the wrong man to mess with, and now they knew it. A cop knocked on the bus door, snapping Frank's attention back to the present. The guy looked young, way too fresh-faced for a day like today. His uniform still crisp like he hadn't been in enough street fights to break it in yet. "Sir, we need to ask you some." He trailed off when Frank just pulled the lever and shut the door in his face. Frank sighed, adjusting his grip on the wheel. "Everybody good?" Earl gave a raspy chuckle. "Hell, son, I was just coming in for my usual morning ride and almost got turned into a statistic. Next time I want some excitement, I'll just play the damn lottery." Simone shook her head, finally snapping out of her daze. "You're really just going to finish the route?" Frank gave her a look. "You paid your fare, didn't you?" Darnell blinked. "Bruh, we just got hijacked. You fought like 6 dudes through a bomb, and now you're just driving again?" Frank shrugged. "Got places to be." Simone exhaled, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I need a drink." "Coffee?" Frank offered. "Something stronger." Earl leaned forward. "Hey, you gonna tell us where the hell you learned to fight like that?" Frank's hands flexed slightly on the wheel. That was the thing about old habits. You might bury them under years of normalcy, but they never really go away. He had spent years trying to leave it all behind. The combat zones, the medevac extractions, the nights spent stitching bullet wounds while explosions rattled the ground. He thought if he just kept moving, kept working, kept his head down, maybe the past wouldn't come knocking. But today proved otherwise. The war might have been over for him, but he was still built for it. He gave Earl a slow, even look. "Used to be in the Army, Special Forces combat medic." Simone's eyebrows shot up. "You're a damn Green Beret?" Frank just turned back to the road, pressing the gas, merging smoothly into traffic. "Was." Earl shook his head, grinning. "Well, ain't that something? A certified badass driving the morning commute. You some kind of secret vigilante or something?" Frank smirked. "Nope, just a guy with a job." The bus rumbled down the street, leaving behind a scene of flashing lights, shattered glass, and the broken remnants of men who thought they were in control. The cops could sort it out. He'd done his part. All that mattered now was getting his passengers where they needed to go. But deep in his gut, Frank felt something shift. Something wasn't right. He caught one last glimpse of the quiet leader through the side mirror, still surrounded by cops, still motionless on the pavement. But then, a small twitch. Frank's eyes narrowed. That wasn't unconsciousness. That was patience. That was a man waiting. And then, as if he could feel Frank watching him, the quiet leader smiled, a slow, knowing smile. And Frank realized something that made his blood turn cold. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Frank kept his grip steady on the wheel, forcing his heartbeat to slow even as every nerve in his body screamed at him to move now. Find the bomb. Stop whatever was coming. But he didn't move. He didn't glance around. That's what the quiet leader wanted, to see him react, to see him panic. The man was watching him, somehow, somewhere, waiting to see if Frank would slip up. That told him something important. The bomb wasn't on a timer. It was manual detonation. If it had been set to go off on its own, the bastard wouldn't have called. No, this was about control, about keeping Frank right where he wanted him. Fine, two could play that game. Frank exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders like he was just shaking off the tension. He took the next turn onto Roosevelt Street, keeping the bus moving at a steady pace. His mind was already working the problem. If the bomb wasn't set to go off automatically, that meant he had time to find it, time to neutralize it, time to make sure no one on this damn bus died today. The quiet leader had given him just enough information to make him squirm, but not enough to win. That meant Frank had a shot at flipping the script. He flicked his eyes to the mirror, scanning the passengers. Earl was still sitting up front, completely unaware that he was riding a rolling death trap for the second time today. Simone had her head down, focused on her phone, probably texting her sister about how she'd need a week-long vacation after this. And Darnell, he was glancing around now, fidgeting. his gut probably telling him something wasn't right. Smart kid. Frank eased his foot off the gas slightly, keeping the bus rolling but giving himself just a fraction more time to work. Where the hell was it? The first bomb had been hidden in a backpack, small enough to tuck away but packed with enough C4 to turn the street into a crater. This one, it had to be somewhere accessible but not obvious. A bag, a package, something that looked like it belonged. His brain ran through the possibilities. Luggage rack, under a seat, near the back exit. There were too many spots, too many variables. And then, a thought hit him like a sledgehammer. The first bomb had been on the bus. That made sense. It kept them trapped inside, forced them into a predictable route. But if the quiet leader was playing a bigger game, if this wasn't just about killing people but about control, about fear, then the second bomb wouldn't be on the bus. It would be somewhere along the route. Frank's hands flexed on the wheel as the realization settled in. That's why he told me to keep driving. The bastard wasn't waiting for him to find the bomb. He was waiting for him to deliver it. Frank forced his face to stay neutral, like nothing had changed, even as his entire body coiled like a spring. His route, that meant the detonation site was coming up, probably in one of the high-traffic areas, a transit hub, an intersection packed with pedestrians, a government building, somewhere that would make headlines. His gut clenched. The transit hub. That was the target. Frank kept the bus moving, but his brain was working at lightning speed now. If he was right, then in less than 5 minutes, he was about to drive a fully loaded city bus into ground zero of a terrorist attack. The quiet leader had planned every step, had accounted for every possibility, except one. He didn't know who the hell he was dealing with. Frank exhaled, keeping his voice steady. "Hey, Earl." The old man looked up, squinting. "Yeah?" Frank met his eyes in the mirror. "You still carry that old flip phone?" Earl frowned but nodded. "Yeah. Why?" Frank smiled slightly. "I need you to do me a favor. Dial 911. Don't hit send yet. Just hold on to it." Earl gave him a long look but didn't argue. "This another one of those trust me situations?" Frank nodded. "Yeah." Earl muttered under his breath, but did what he was told. Now for the hard part. Frank eased the bus into the left lane, heading straight for the next intersection. The transit hub was coming up, a massive open-air bus terminal packed with morning commuters. If he kept going, if he followed the route like they expected him to, he'd be delivering 30 people straight into an explosion. He needed an out, but not just any out. He needed to break the pattern. He spotted it. An underpass. If he could get the bus underneath, he could use the concrete to block the blast radius. That was step one. Step two, forcing the quiet leader to act before he was ready. Frank took a breath, then he slammed the gas. The bus lurched forward, picking up speed. The sudden acceleration made the passengers jolt in their seats. Simone grabbed the rail. Frank?" Earl's head snapped up. "What the hell are you doing, son?" Frank didn't answer. The transit hub was getting closer. The detonation trigger was coming into range. If he was right, the second bomb was on a building near the hub, rigged to go off when the bus crossed a certain point. He needed to beat the timing. He needed to force the trigger man into making a mistake. The underpass was 20 yards ahead. 15. Then the phone rang, not Earl's. Frank's the quiet leader. Frank answered without slowing down. "You think you're clever?" the voice asked. No longer calm, no longer smug. Frank smiled. "I know I am." The underpass was 5 yards away. "Turn this bus around," the quiet leader ordered. "Or they all die." Frank didn't even hesitate. "Nah." And then he yanked the wheel hard to the right. The bus careened off course, barreling straight into the underpass at full speed. Horns blared as cars swerved to avoid him. But Frank didn't stop. He plowed forward, tires screeching, getting every last inch of the vehicle beneath solid concrete. And then behind him, the world exploded. A fireball erupted in the distance, a shockwave rattling the bus as a nearby building detonated in a violent burst of flame and debris. People screamed. Alarms blared. The city plunged into chaos. But Frank just let out a slow breath. He had been right. The bomb hadn't been on the bus. It had been waiting for him to arrive. But now, it had gone off too soon. Frank pulled the bus to a stop, taking a moment to let his heartbeat settle. Then he put the phone back to his ear. "Guess your plan didn't work," he said. Silence. Then finally, the quiet leader let out a low, dangerous chuckle. "This was never the plan, Frank." Frank's grip tightened. This was just the beginning. And then the call cut off. Frank exhaled slowly, staring out at the burning cityscape beyond the underpass. He had stopped the bomb, but the real war had just begun. Frank sat in the driver's seat, watching the flames rage in the distance, the heat from the explosion distorting the air like a mirage. The underpass had done its job, shielded the bus, protected the passengers, kept him from delivering 30 people straight into the jaws of a terrorist attack. But his gut told him this wasn't a victory, just a delay. The quiet leader's words still echoed in his head. This was never the plan. This was just the beginning. That meant the real play was still in motion, and he was already behind. He exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel, forcing himself to think through the smoke and adrenaline flooding his veins. The attack was always about control, not just destruction. The hijacking, the first bomb, the second one, each move designed to keep him moving forward, keep him reacting instead of acting. They had planned for a different driver, which meant whoever they were really after was still out there, still exposed, still in play. Frank's hands flexed. He had to get ahead of this before the next hit landed. The passengers were stirring, reality settling in. Earl was the first to break the silence, letting out a low whistle as he looked past Frank toward the explosion's aftermath. "Well, hell, son, you weren't kidding about today not being normal." Simone was gripping the metal pole near her seat, so tight, her knuckles were turning white. "What the hell is going on?" she whispered, her voice half a prayer, half a demand for answers. Darnell hadn't moved, still pressed against the window, staring at the smoke rising into the sky. "That could have been us," he muttered, barely audible. Frank nodded once, kept his voice steady. "Yeah, but it wasn't." He wasn't about to let fear take over. Fear was contagious, and right now they couldn't afford to start panicking. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through his recent calls, and hit dial. The line rang twice before it picked up. "Delgado?" The voice on the other end was sharp. "All business." "Ruiz," Frank said, keeping his tone even. He had known Ruiz since they were both overseas, back when Frank was patching up soldiers and Ruiz was kicking down doors. Now Ruiz worked counter-terrorism, which meant if anyone was going to have answers, it was him. "You call me the same morning a bomb goes off in my city," Ruiz said, his voice edged with suspicion. "Tell me you're not involved in this mess." Frank glanced at the rearview mirror, at his passengers, at the wreckage in the distance. "Not my mess," he said. "But I'm in the middle of it anyway." Ruiz exhaled hard. "Tell me what you know." Frank kept it short, efficient, listing out the hijacking, the first bomb, the second bomb, the call from the quiet leader. He didn't have time for details, didn't have time to explain why he was even still driving a bus after a morning like this. By the time he finished, Ruiz had gone quiet, which meant he was thinking, running his own calculations. When he finally spoke, his voice was grim. "Delgado, this doesn't sound like a one-off hit." "It's not," Frank said. "Which means I need to know what's coming next." "That's the problem," Ruiz said, and Frank could already hear the tension in his voice, the edge that meant something wasn't adding up. "We didn't get chatter on this. Nothing in the wind. Attacks like this don't just happen without warning." Frank's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much. "Someone buried it," he said. "Hard." Ruiz hesitated. "You said they expected a different driver." "Yeah, then they weren't targeting civilians," Ruiz muttered. "They were targeting the bus." The words landed like a hammer in Frank's chest. The bus, not a random attack, not a hostage situation, a setup. Which meant the bus itself, or more specifically, the usual driver, was a key part of something bigger. "Who else runs this route?" Frank asked, brain shifting gears. Ruiz was already ahead of him. "I'll pull the list, see who's missing." Frank nodded. "Do it fast." The sound of sirens was getting closer. Cops were moving in now, responding to the chaos, probably scrambling to figure out why their city just turned into a war zone. Frank didn't have time for them. He couldn't sit around answering questions when he still didn't know where the next hit was coming from. He looked back at the passengers. "Everybody good?" Earl snorted. "Define good." Simone exhaled, rubbing her temples. "Are we safe now?" Frank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he put the bus in gear. "We're moving." Darnell blinked. "Where?" Frank checked the side mirror, scanning the road, scanning for anything out of place, to find out who was supposed to be driving this bus. Because if this wasn't over yet, then whoever was behind it still had another move to play. And Frank Delgado wasn't about to sit around waiting to find out what it was. Franken guided the bus back onto the road, merging smoothly into traffic like he wasn't driving away from the second bomb attack of the morning. The passengers were rattled but quiet, the kind of stunned silence that came when people had seen too much, but weren't sure how to process it yet. Simone kept shifting in her seat like she wanted to ask a million questions, but didn't know where to start, while Darnell stared out the window, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. Earl just sat there with his arms crossed, shaking his head every few minutes, like he was debating whether or not to start yelling about how things used to be different back in his day. Frank didn't offer them explanations. What was he supposed to say? That a highly organized terror cell had just used this bus to try and carry out a precision attack? That the first bomb was a diversion, and the second one had been meant to make headlines? That he had no idea what the next move was, but if the quiet leader's words meant anything, then Phoenix was still on the clock. No, they didn't need that wait. Not yet. He needed answers first. He needed to get ahead of this before it turned into something worse. His phone buzzed again. Ruiz. Good. That meant he had something. Frank picked up, keeping his eyes on the road. "Talk to me." "I pulled the transit logs," Ruiz said, voice tense. "The driver assigned to your route today was a guy named Hector Mendez, but he didn't show up for work this morning." Frank's grip tightened on the wheel. "Where is he?" "That's the problem," Ruiz muttered. "Nobody knows. His supervisor tried calling him when he was late, but no answer. I sent a unit to his apartment. Door was open. No sign of him." Frank's gut clenched. So there it was. The hijacking had never been about a random attack. It had been about him. "Think he's dead?" Frank asked, already knowing the answer. Ruiz hesitated. "No body, no blood, no sign of a struggle." Frank exhaled. That didn't make him feel better. Sometimes a body meant it was over. No body meant it was still happening. Ruiz continued. "You were a contingency, Delgado. They expected Mendez to be on that bus. Whatever they had planned, they wanted him behind the wheel." Frank nodded to himself. That made sense. Mendez was supposed to be their unwitting delivery system, the guy who would have unknowingly driven straight into the blast zone. But something had changed, and Frank had stepped into a role that wasn't meant for him. That meant he was already off script. He glanced at the passengers in the mirror again, watching the tension still hanging over them. "What do we know about Mendez?" Ruiz sighed. "Normal guy. No criminal record. No red flags. Worked this route for 6 years. Family man, wife, 2 kids. The kind of guy you wouldn't expect to be at the center of something like this." Frank's mind was already running through possibilities. Either Mendez had been targeted because of something he knew, or they had chosen him because he was forgettable. Either way, Frank needed to find him before it was too late. "You got a location on the wife?" Ruiz hesitated. "Yeah, but there's a problem." Frank exhaled. "There's always a problem. She's missing too." That settled like a lead weight in Frank's chest. Ruiz continued. "Whoever took Mendez didn't just grab him. They took his family too, probably as leverage." Frank nodded to himself. That fit. The easiest way to control a man wasn't by threatening his life. It was by threatening the people he loved. He took a slow breath, thinking, "Any contacts?" Family, friends, anybody who might know where he'd go. Ruiz shuffled through something on the other end. His brother Carlos Mendez runs an auto shop on the south side. Last person Hector called before he disappeared. That was something. A lead. Frank adjusted the wheel. Send me the address. Ruiz hesitated. You sure you don't want to sit this one out, Delgado? You already walked into the middle of something big. Let us handle it. Frank let out a short, dry laugh. Yeah? Like you guys handled the bombs? Ruiz sighed. You're gonna get yourself killed, man. Frank's voice was steady. Not today. He hung up. A second later, a text came through. The address. Frank pulled the bus into a side street and eased it to a stop. Then he turned in his seat, finally looking at his passengers. This is where you all get off. Earl frowned. We at the end of the line? Nope, Frank said. But this ride's not safe anymore. Simone narrowed her eyes. Was it ever? Fair point. Darnell hesitated. You're going after them, aren't you? Frank didn't answer. Just unlocked the doors. One by one, they got up. Earl muttered something about bus drivers these days and shuffled off. Simone lingered for a second, then shook her head and followed. Darnell was the last to leave. He stopped at the door, looking back at Frank like he wanted to say something, then just gave a small nod and stepped off. Frank closed the doors behind them, waited until they were safely on the sidewalk. Then he put the bus back into gear and took off toward Carlos Mendez's shop. This wasn't over, not even close. Frank kept the bus moving, weaving through Phoenix's mid-morning traffic like a man on a mission, because that's exactly what he was. His mind was running through every possible scenario, every possible angle. Hector Mendez was supposed to be driving today. The terrorists had planned around that, expecting a regular, predictable man behind the wheel, someone who wouldn't question things until it was too late. But Mendez hadn't shown up for work. Someone had gotten to him first, which meant whoever was pulling the strings still needed him for something. They hadn't killed him. Not yet. The question was, why? Carlos Mendez's auto shop was tucked into a strip of rundown businesses on the south side, wedged between a pawn shop with barred windows and a taqueria that Frank knew from experience had the best damn carne asada in the city. He pulled the bus into the narrow lot, killed the engine, and took a moment to scan the area. No cops, no unmarked surveillance vehicles, no obvious threats, just a normal everyday auto shop with a red and white sign that had probably seen better days. Frank stepped off the bus and walked toward the open garage bay, where a man in grease-stained overalls was half buried under the hood of an old sedan, cursing at something he couldn't seem to fix. Carlos Mendez. His shoulders were tense, his movements too sharp, the kind of body language Frank recognized from men who had too much on their minds and no good way to deal with it. Carlos heard footsteps and turned, wiping his hands on a rag before giving Frank a wary once-over. We closed, man. Come back later. Frank didn't slow down. Not here for a tune-up. Carlos frowned. You a cop? Frank smirked. Do I look like one? Carlos eyed him again. Military. Frank nodded. Once Carlos exhaled, tossing the rag onto a workbench. Yeah, well, that was a long time ago. Frank leaned against the hood of the car. Not long enough. He let the silence stretch for a second before cutting straight to it. Your brother's missing. His family too. Carlos stiffened. He covered it well, but Frank saw the reaction. The slight hitch in his breath. The way his fingers flexed against the metal of the car like he needed something to hold on to. I don't know anything about that. Frank sighed. Come on, man. Man, I don't have time for this. I just got off a bus that was supposed to be rigged to explode. Your brother was supposed to be driving it. Somebody took him. Now I'm standing here in your shop because you were the last person he called before he disappeared. Carlos's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. That was something. Frank pressed forward. So tell me, did he say anything? Did he sound off? Did he sound off? Did he say anything? Carlos threw up a hand. You think I don't want to help him? He's my brother. Frank held his gaze. Then help me find him. Carlos hesitated, then exhaled sharply. running a hand over his face. He called me last night. Said something felt wrong. Said he saw somebody watching him, following his bus. I told him to come here, lay low, but Carlos shook his head. He never made it. Frank processed that quickly. Mendez had known something was off. That meant he wasn't completely blind to what was happening, which explained why the terrorists had to take him instead of just waiting for him to show up at work. But it also raised another question. If they had him, and they already tried to pull off the bombing without him, what did they still need him for? Carlos sighed. I tried calling him again this morning. No answer. Then I got a text from his phone. Frank straightened. What did it say? Carlos grabbed his phone from his back pocket, thumbed through his messages, then turned the screen toward Frank. Keep your mouth shut. Frank stared at the words, at the implications behind them. Hector was alive, but someone was using him to keep Carlos quiet. That meant whatever was happening wasn't over yet. Hector was still a part of the plan. Frank took a slow breath. If they're keeping him alive, they still need something from him. Carlos nodded. Yeah, but what? Frank's mind was already running ahead. Whatever this is, it's bigger than just a bombing. They could have pulled that off without him. No, they took him for a reason. He looked at Carlos. Do you have access to his work records? Carlos frowned. I mean, yeah. He's logged into the transit system through his home computer. Why? Frank didn't answer. He just grabbed Carlos's keys from the workbench. Carlos blinked. Hey man. Frank tossed them in the air, caught them. You're driving. Carlos hesitated. Then, seeing whatever the hell was in Frank's expression, he exhaled, grabbed his jacket, and muttered, Damn it. They climbed into Carlos's truck, the engine growling to life. Frank glanced at him. Where's his house? Carlos shifted into gear. North side. 10 minutes, Frank nodded. If Hector Mendez's home computer was still logged into the transit system, it might tell them where the next attack was going to be. But something in Frank's gut told him they were already running out of time. Carlos drove like a man with something to lose, gripping the wheel tight as the truck sped through the Phoenix streets. Frank sat in the passenger seat, eyes scanning the road, his mind running 100 miles an hour. Hector had been taken, not killed. His family too. The terrorists had still gone through with the bombing attempt, which meant whatever they needed from him, they still hadn't gotten it. That made Frank's gut twist. A man like Hector Mendez didn't have access to anything high level. He was a bus driver, an everyday guy. That meant the answer wasn't about who he was, but what he did. Carlos took a sharp turn onto a residential street, pulling up in front of a modest single-story house with a small front yard. The place looked normal, nothing out of place, no broken windows, no sign of a struggle. But Frank knew better than to trust appearances. He scanned the area as they stepped out of the truck. No strange cars parked nearby, no obvious surveillance, but that didn't mean someone wasn't watching from a distance. Carlos unlocked the door, pushing it open cautiously, tension rolling off him in waves. Hector, he called, voice tight. No answer. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Frank stepped inside, taking in everything. The living room was neat, pictures of Hector's wife and kids on the wall, a half-empty coffee mug still sitting on the kitchen counter. They had been taken fast, no time to fight, no time to run. Carlos moved toward the back room, where a small desk with an outdated computer sat against the wall. The screen was still on, the transit system's internal portal open. Frank stepped closer, scanning the interface. Schedules, routes, shift assignments, everything was here, and then he saw it. A flagged notification, something that didn't belong. Carlos leaned over his shoulder. What is that? Frank clicked it. A map loaded onto the screen, showing bus routes across Phoenix. But this wasn't the normal transit map. It had red markers, specific locations highlighted. He zoomed in. Bridges, tunnels, major intersections, not random spots, choke points. Carlos sucked in a breath. Jesus, You think this is Frank didn't answer. He was already pulling out his phone, calling Ruiz. The cop answered on the first ring. Tell me you got something. Frank didn't waste time. They weren't just targeting one bus. They were targeting the whole damn city. Silence. Then Ruiz cursed. You sure? I'm looking at Hector's transit logs. The system's been accessed remotely. Someone flagged key locations across multiple routes. Bombs were never the real objective. The first one was a test, a scare tactic. The second one was meant to disrupt emergency response. This isn't just about destruction, Ruiz. This is about shutting Phoenix down. Ruiz muttered something in Spanish. How many locations? 6. Frank's eyes scanned the screen. 2 already hit. That means we got 4 more on the clock. Ruiz exhaled sharply. All right, I'll put out alerts. Send units to lock down the sites. Frank shook his head. Not enough. These guys planned around the system. They knew where the holes were, knew how to move without setting off alarms. We need to figure out where they're going next. Carlos was already scrolling through the files. Wait, this isn't just about the routes. Look at the timing. Frank leaned in. He was right. The locations weren't just random targets. They were sequenced, meant to trigger in a pattern. He studied the next highlighted marker, Union Station. Frank's stomach dropped. That was one of the busiest transit hubs in the state. He grabbed his keys. We're going. Carlos frowned. Going where? Frank was already moving. To stop a damn massacre. Carlos hesitated for half a second, then followed. Frank hit the gas the second they were back in the truck, tires screeching as they tore out of the neighborhood. His mind was locked in now, heart hammering, instinct screaming that time was already running out. He switched to speakerphone as Ruiz's voice came back on the line. We're en route, Ruiz said. I got units heading to Union Station now. Frank barely dodged a red light. Not fast enough. You don't understand what's coming. You think they're hitting the station. Frank's grip tightened on the wheel. I think they're already there. Carlos swore under his breath. Ruiz exhaled. Then we better move faster. The city blurred past, traffic merging into a single chaotic mess. Frank could already see it, the next scene unfolding in his head. A busy transit hub. Hundreds of commuters, workers, families. A timed explosion wouldn't just kill people. It would cripple Phoenix, shut everything down, send the city into chaos. And that was exactly what these guys wanted. Not today. Frank clenched his jaw and floored it. This wasn't going to be another attack. This was going to be the end of the line. Frank barely slowed as he wove through traffic, his truck slicing through the chaos like a missile locked onto its target. Union Station was less than 10 minutes away, but it might as well have been an hour, with the way time felt stretched thin. Every second counted now. Somewhere inside that station, the real attack was waiting to unfold. If they didn't get there in time, Phoenix would never be the same. Carlos was gripping the dashboard like a man who regretted ever getting into the passenger seat. He wasn't used to this. Frank was. Adrenaline made everything sharper, clearer. The road ahead, the sound of sirens converging, the growing weight in his gut that told him they were already cutting it too close. Ruiz was still on speaker, coordinating from his end. I've got officers on the way, but they won't be there for another 5 minutes. Frank's grip tightened on the wheel. We don't have 5 minutes. He took the next turn too fast, tires screeching, barely missing a sedan whose driver laid on the horn. Didn't matter. He was already scanning for threats, his mind running ahead, trying to put himself in the enemy's position. The previous bombs had been diversions. This was the real target. The question was, where inside the station would they hit? Carlos was staring at the transit map on his phone, trying to keep up. You think they planted another bomb? Frank shook his head. No, if they wanted another explosion, they wouldn't need Mendez alive. This isn't about destruction, it's about control. They want to take over the station. Carlos frowned. For what? Frank exhaled sharply. Because if you control the transit hub, you control the city. Shut down Union Station. You don't just stop buses and trains. You shut down emergency response. You gridlock Phoenix. You turn an attack into something bigger. Chaos, panic, a citywide lockdown. Carlos swore. And my brother. You think they're using him to get in? Or they already have? Frank muttered. He could see the station now, the massive arched entrance coming into view. People moving in and out, completely oblivious to the fact that they were minutes away from a war zone. If the terrorists were inside, they weren't waiting for the cops to show up. They were making their move now. Frank didn't slow down. He cut the wheel hard, skidding into the parking lot, the truck coming to a stop with a jolt. He was already moving before the engine cut off. Carlos scrambling to keep up as they sprinted toward the entrance. And then gunfire. The sharp, echoing cracks of automatic rifles sent the entire station into chaos. People screamed, scattering like wildfire, as masked gunmen pushed through the main concourse. Frank counted at least 6 men, moving with military precision, cutting off exits, forcing civilians into a tight corner. Hostage situation. Carlos froze beside him, eyes wide. Jesus. Frank grabbed his shoulder, pushing him toward cover behind a pillar.
Stay down.
He scanned the crowd, looking for one person. If Hector was here, he was their leverage. If Frank could find him first, he could break their control before the real damage started. The lead gunman stepped forward, his mask pulled up just enough to reveal the smirk of a man who thought he had already won. He pulled a radio from his vest, speaking into it. "We have control. Bring him in." Frank clenched his jaw. They weren't done moving pieces yet.
Stay down.
A side door opened, and Hector Mendez stumbled forward, his hands bound, a rifle barrel pressing into his back. His face was bruised, but he was alive. The gunman behind him shoved him to his knees in the middle of the concourse, a clear message to everyone watching.
Stay down.
Frank's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a takeover, this was an execution. The lead gunman raised his weapon, aiming at Hector's head. They were making an example out of him. Frank moved. Fast. He didn't hesitate. He couldn't. He ripped the pistol from the holster of a fallen security guard, leveled it, and fired in one fluid motion. The shot hit the executioner in the shoulder, spinning him sideways before he could pull the trigger. The crowd erupted into fresh panic, people surging toward the exits as gunfire tore through the air. The other gunmen reacted instantly, their weapons snapping toward Frank's position. Too late. He was already moving. He vaulted over a ticket counter, rolling into cover as bullets shattered glass behind him. Carlos, still behind the pillar, yelled, "What the hell are you doing?" Frank didn't answer. He was already scanning, already recalculating. The element of surprise was gone. Now it was just a firefight. The gunmen spread out, covering angles. They were trained, but Frank had seen better. They weren't expecting a lone man to fight back. He counted them again. 5 left, 1 near the escalator, 1 by the baggage claim, 2 flanking the concourse, and the last was moving for Hector. Frank's pulse kicked into overdrive. They were going to kill him anyway. He moved before the thought was finished, pushing forward, firing 2 precise shots that dropped the nearest gunman before the bastard even knew what hit him. 4 left, the others retaliated fast, bullets chewing through marble and glass, forcing Frank to drop low and move toward the edge of the concourse. Carlos, still ducking behind cover, shouted, "This is insane." Frank exhaled, "Welcome to my life." One of the gunmen made a mistake, stepping too far into the open, assuming Frank was pinned down. Frank didn't miss. 1 clean shot, center mass, 3 left. Sirens were blaring outside now. The police were moving in, but it wasn't fast enough. This needed to end before they got here. The gunman by the escalator fired again, rounds sparking off metal. Frank grabbed a discarded chair, flinging it full force, making the shooter flinch. That half second was enough. Frank lunged forward, closed the distance, and took him down with a brutal strike to the throat. 2 left. The last 2 gunmen hesitated. They knew they had lost. One of them, the smarter of the 2, dropped his weapon and ran for the emergency exit. Frank let him go. He'd get picked up outside. That left one. Frank turned toward him, the quiet leader. still standing, still smiling. Frank aimed the gun. It's over. The quiet leader tilted his head. You sure? Frank saw it too late. The bastard had one last trigger in his hand. Carlos yelled. Frank fired. The shot hit home, the leader staggering backward, but his thumb pressed down. A detonation sounded, but not here. Frank's stomach dropped. The explosion came from outside. Frank turned just in time to see a column of fire erupt near the station's entrance. Not a bomb, a vehicle, a van rigged to explode, meant to block the cops from moving in. The leader, bleeding out, laughed. Told you this was just the beginning. Frank walked up to him, grabbed his vest, and yanked him close. You lose, the leader coughed, smirked. Do I? Frank didn't bother responding. One final punch, and the bastard was out cold. Carlos exhaled hard. Holy hell. Frank turned, scanning the wreckage. The gunmen were down. Hector was alive. The station was intact. The war wasn't over. But today, Phoenix was still standing, and that was enough.